Hey Honors Algebra 2 kids, I'm doing a video on writing trig functions. So you have already learned how to graph sine, cosine, and tangent functions. What we're going to do is we're going to look at functions that have already been graphed, so the graph of a function, and then write the equation from it. What I like to do is I like to follow some basic steps. So first what I like to kind of do, you can write this down, and if you want to get a close-up of that, you can kind of follow the picture of my graph. So step number one, we're going to determine the midline. So remember, the midline is that line that basically cuts your graph in half. So if I look at here, this is the line that kind of cuts my graph in half. If you also remember, this is also called my k-value in my equation. So it's important that I recognize, if I'm going to write the equation, that I know what that line is. So for this example, I know that my midline is at 3, so I know my k-value is 3. All right, step 2. What we're going to do next is determine the amplitude. If you remember, the amplitude is the distance from the midline to the max, or the midline to the min. So like this distance here, or you can think of it as this distance here. Either way, when you look at it, remember it's a distance, so it's a positive number. So that distance is 3. And if you remember, this is called our a value in our equation. So for this example, my a value is also 3. Okay, step 3. We are going to find the period of our graph. So actually the period is not part of your equation, but we need to use the period to find the b value that's in your equation. So what I look for first is I look for one complete revolution, and it doesn't really matter where you start. I try to always kind of start at the origin, but it doesn't really matter. So like if I start here at the origin, if I trace the part of my graph, I know that the period is 4 pi. And the reason I know that is because that's how long it takes for the graph to kind of do one complete cycle before it starts repeating again. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that information, that the period is 4 pi, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that to figure out what my b value is. So I'm going to start with my equation for period, which is 2 pi over b, and so this is the period. I'm going to set it equal to 4 pi, because I know that the period of this function is 4 pi. I like to cross multiply. You can do this a couple different ways. And then I'm going to solve for b. So if I divide both sides by 4 pi, I get 2/4, or in other words, 1/2. All right, so I've already got my k value, my a value, my b value. At this time, you want to either choose that you're going to pick a sine or a cosine function. Now the fun part about this is you can write an infinite number of equations for every one of these graphs. You can write it as a sine function, you can write it as a cosine function, you can write it as a reflected sine function or a reflected cosine function, or with various shifts. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick what I want to do. I'm going to go ahead, how I know which one I want to pick. If I want to pick a sine function, I know I want to start at the midline. So if I'm going to pick a sine function, I know the point I'm going to start with has to be on my midline. So I'm going to pick one of these points to kind of start my graph. If I pick a cosine function, I want to start at a min or a max, depending if you want it reflected or not. So remember, cosine functions start at a max. If it's reflected, it would start at a min. So I'll show you how to do both, but I'm first going to start by doing the sine function. So here's my generic formula for a sine function. I'm going to plug in everything I know, and then I'm going to write my equation. So I'm going to pick, I knew that a was 3, my b value was 1/2. We'll talk about the h here in a minute, and then my k value is 3. So in order to get your h value, you have to determine which point you want to start with, which is why there's infinite number of ways to write this equation. So if I start here, at this midline point, then I know that I shifted it to the right pi, which means a shift to the right pi would mean I'd have to go minus pi here. If I started here, then I would shift it to the right 3 pi. If I started with this point, I would shift it to the left pi. So it depends on which point you start with, depends on what your h value is going to be. So this is one equation for this line. Let me show you real quick how I could write the same equation, but using a cosine function. The nice thing is the only difference between writing a cosine and a sine function is our h value. The a, the b, the k, all stays the same. If I want to do a cosine function, I would have to pick a min or a max. So I could pick this maximum, or I could pick this minimum, or I could pick any min or max. Let's say I picked this one right here. That would mean that I'm shifting it to the right pi over 2. So I just have to put minus pi over 2 there. This equation, if you graph it in your calculator, or this equation, if you graph it in your calculator, will still give you the exact same graph. Kind of cool. All right, I'm gonna go through a couple more examples, so just so that you can kind of get the hang of it. Keep going. All right, so if you remember our steps, our first step is to determine the midline. So if you look at this graph,
Don't see it.
You got it?
Yep.
All right, so if you look at this graph, my max is at 1, my min is at -5. So you could always average that. So if I added -5 and 1, I get -4. And then take the average, which means divide by 2. My midline is right here at -2. So that means my k value is -2. My amplitude is that distance from the midline to the max or the midline to the min. Either way, it's going to be a distance of 3.
You can, it's okay.
Okay, you got it, Haley? Okay. Sorry, my daughter's doing the camera work here. All right, next we're going to find the period. So 2 pi over b is the formula for period. And what I'm going to look for is 1 complete revolution of my graph. So if I start here at this origin, so it's not really at the origin, but it's at the y-axis, and I go 1 revolution, it takes me from 0 to 8, which means the period of this graph is 8. So I'm going to set this equal to 8 and solve for b. And I'm going to divide both sides by 8. So what I end up getting is pi over 4. So that's my b value. All right, next I'm going to decide on if I want cosine or sine. Remember, you can pick either. I'm going to decide on cosine this time. So I'm going to put in my cosine function looks like this. I'm going to plug in my a value. I'm going to plug in my b value. And I'm going to plug in my k value. All right, I'll show you how to do a reflected cosine. So a reflected cosine means instead of picking, if it's cosine, you want to pick a min or a max. If I want a reflected cosine, I just want a minimum. So I'm going to pick this point right here. So first of all, I'm going to add a negative in front. So that way I can get, that reflection going on. But also you notice that it's shifted to the right 2. So I'm going to put a -2 in there for my h value. And that's your equation. All right. I want to go through a couple other examples. The next example has us looking at the equation, but this time I didn't give you a graph. Here, so yeah, make sure you span out so you can see the whole equation. So the problem reads, write the equation of the trig function with a max point of pi over 4, 6, and a min point of 3 pi over 4, -2. All right. You can always graph this. What I'm going to start with is I'm going to start by finding the period of my function. So to do that, what I'm going to do is the period is always dealing with the x-axis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract my x values. So 3 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 equals 2 pi over 4, or in other words, pi over 2. Now, if you remember, when you're graphing this, so think about if I graph this. Let's say I picked pi over 4, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so let's say this is pi over 4, this is 6. And let's say this point is 3 pi over 4, so that's 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi over 4, and negative 2 down here. What this is, if you think about it, this is 1 max to 1 min. So when I subtract my x values, I'm actually only getting half the period because it's 1 max to 1 min. What I need to get the whole period is I need to double it. So I'm going to go back to this. After I subtracted my x values, I'm just going to double it. So I'm going to multiply by 2, which means the period of my function is pi. All right, so now that I know the period of the function is pi, I'm going to use that to write my equation. So I'm going to go 2 pi over b equals pi, and I'm going to solve for b. So I get a b value of 2. All right, next up. What we're going to do is we're going to find the midline. So if you look at your graph, if you've already kind of graphed this based off the points, you could kind of just look at the y values and say, okay, well, what's halfway between 6 and negative 2? Or you could literally just average them. So if I added 6 and negative 2 together, I get 4. And if I average it, divide by 2, I get 2. Which means my midline would be at positive 2. So that's going to be the middle of my graph. So again, what I found there is that k equals 2, because that's my midline. Now that I know the midline, so I've got the b value, I've got the k value, I can also find my amplitude. Remember, the amplitude is the distance from the midline to the max or midline to the min. So in this case, my amplitude is going to be 4. So that's my a value. All right, next what I would do is I would put it all together and write your equation. So again, if I just asked you to write the equation, you could pick sine or cosine. So I'll start with, I'll go a cosine. It seems more, we got a max and a min. I might as well go with a cosine function. I'm going to plug in my a value of 4. I'm going to plug in my b value of 2. So if I start with this maximum right here, that means I shifted it to the right pi over 4. So I'm just going to put my h value as pi over 4. And then my k value is 2. And that's the equation.